Okay, guys, good morning. Welcome back. Just another few minutes till we get started today. Hey, Sebastian, good morning. Hey there, Angel. Welcome back. Hey, Chase. Good morning. Just another minute, I guess, to go. Good morning, Zoe. Hope you guys are doing good. Claire, welcome back. Hello, Zachary. Come into the room. Hello, hey. Okay, guys, so I'm just going to get things rolling because now we're at 10 a.m. So welcome back as usual. Glad to see you guys. And today the meeting is all about continuing our lessons on the philosophy of mind. We need to start talking about the physicalist side of this debate. So today we will begin with that by looking at the writing of Daniel Stoljar and his 2005 paper called just Physicalism. Briefly, let me just kind of recap where we have been so far in these lessons on philosophy of mind. So philosophy of mind is all about consciousness, perception, introspection. So your mental life, what's the nature of that? Is that just based on the physical brain, or is there something like a soul? Can consciousness be explained on a physical basis or not? There are two major positions here. There's monism and dualism. Monism says that everything in the universe is made out of one kind of substance, and dualism says that everything in the universe is made out of two kinds of substance. In monism, there are two possible views. There's physicalism and idealism. Physicalist monism says that everything in the universe is made out of physical matter, even including us and our thoughts and our consciousness. So if you believe in physicalism, then everything's physical, including me, you, and our thoughts. Everything's made out of atoms at the last detail. So atoms are just these tiny little bits of matter that take up space, that are extended in space. And according to physicalism, everything in the whole universe is made out of these atoms, even thought, perception, and so on. But on the dualist side of the debate, there's both physical matter and mind. Now, mind is considered to be something that does not have any extension in space, doesn't have any shape, size, mass, or volume, but nonetheless, it's thinking. So you got to think there of the idea of like a soul or just a pure consciousness, not even connected necessarily to the body or brain. According to dualism, there's both matter and mind. And one argument for that was Rene Descartes' argument for dualism. So I'm going to really briefly summarize some of the big points in his argument. But he says that using the method of doubt, you're able to doubt everything you perceive with your senses, even math and logic, essentially because maybe everything could be a dream or whatever. so you can't necessarily guarantee that the things you think you're perceiving are real. Nonetheless, he says, even though you can doubt all of that, you cannot doubt that you exist because you're thinking. So even if everything you perceive, including your own body, is just a dream or an illusion, nonetheless, you'd be the thinker having these thoughts, and so you exist as a mind, if nothing else, on the simple basis that you're thinking at all. So since you're thinking, you have thoughts, you have different ideas. He says one of the ideas in the mind is the idea of God, and he points out that this is a unique and special idea because it's the one and only idea of something that has infinite reality. It's the idea of an infinite being. So in his view, since you do have an idea of an infinite being, it has to be caused by something that is at least infinite. And therefore, there is a God because it's the only possible cause of the infinite idea that you have of God. So anyway, then having proven that God exists, he says that God is known to be perfectly good and benevolent. And since he is, that means that when you have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. If they were not true, then God would be creating us only so that we could have clear perceptions, but that are still false, and that would be deceptive. So we can be guaranteed then that clear and distinct perceptions are true. And among those clear and distinct perceptions, one of them is the notion that if two things can be clearly understood or imagined as existing separately, then they really are two separate things. I think I mentioned the example of me and the watch. Obviously, it's easy to imagine me and the watch existing separately, or I could even show you the real case of me and the watch being separated. But the author says that any two things that can be understood as existing separately really are, whether or not they're attached for the moment. And we can clearly conceive of the mind and the body existing separately, since, after all, the method of doubt entails that it's possible for the mind to exist with no body. So therefore, since we can clearly conceive of the mind and the body existing separately, they really are two separate things, as guaranteed by the perfect benevolence of God, who makes sure that clear and distinct perceptions are true. Okay, and then that was really his argument for dualism. It's based on conceivability, because you can clearly conceive of or think of your mind and body existing separately. They must be able to exist separately. And he added a few other points after that, like it is now clear and distinct that the external world exists and that you do have a body, and he gave some additional reasons for why those things are clear and distinct also. But now that brings us to the other side of the coin. We're going to try and build up some of the arguments and ideas of physicalism. And the author that'll start this for us is this author, Daniel Stoljar. I don't have his dates of his life. He's pretty young, still living. Is an Australian philosopher, and in 2005 he wrote this paper we're going to study, which is called just Physicalism. So that's the author and topic of today, Daniel Stoljar, in the 2005 paper Physicalism. All right, so what he's trying to do in this paper is simply explain what physicalism is, and then on top of that, to try and make the argument that it's true. So to define and explain physicalism, and then to try and make the case that it's actually true. So the first topic or point that he wants to mention is to give a good definition of physicalism. And he gives a pretty blunt and straightforward, plain-spoken definition of it. He says physicalism is just this. It means that everything is physical. So physicalism, what does this mean? In a way, almost too simple. Everything is physical. So it is a position about what everything in this universe is made out of. It says everything, all things, not just some things, but every single thing, 100% of everything is just physical. There's nothing that's not physical. So it claims that all things in the universe and in nature and across the board are physical things. According to this view, the nature of the universe is that it's a physical universe. And if you think about it, Stoljar says, according to physicalism, every field of study is really just an indirect branch of physics. Even those fields of study that don't immediately appear to have anything to do with physics. Like, say, for example, that you were studying history, and you're like really big into learning about the French Revolution or something. And you might think, well, I definitely didn't choose to study physics in college because I'm doing history and it has nothing to do with physics. And in general, yeah, I agree. But if you think about it in the biggest possible picture, if physicalism is true and everything is just made out of physical matter and everything's physical, then what is the French Revolution? It's a series of events happening on the planet Earth with these human life forms, these biological entities, and they're operating according to known or unknown laws of nature, physics, and biology. And so the outcome of the events playing out, we call it the French Revolution, but really it's just a bunch of physical particles grouped together as these sentient life forms doing stuff on a certain planet's surface. So what is a poet? What is a musician? What is a historian? Any of these things that you're studying are still just studying, according to physicalism, some indirectly related concepts of physics, because all life processes, all human choices and actions are governed by the laws of physics and are essentially formed by matter acting in space according to these natural laws. So he mentions that. He says, if you really think about it, physicalism implies that everything is kind of related to physics, even those things that don't immediately seem to be. Now, there's other versions of monism. If you go way back in history, we're talking about physicalist monism, which is like the current day, like modern day idea of it. But way back in like ancient Greece, there was this one philosopher, just as a point of comparison, whose name was Thales, Thales. Ancient pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Thales. He had his own type of monism, but it wasn't physicalism. Let me tell you about it. He thought that everything in the universe was made out of water. Okay, how weird is that? That everything's just different states of water. So look around you, all these things, according to Thales, it's all just water in various combinations and states. Now, today, of course, we would look at that as a silly view because we know so much more scientifically than people knew thousands of years ago. But you can almost understand why maybe people pre-modern ancient people might have thought that, because you see that water can take different forms, that it can be in a solid state, that it could be a vapor or a liquid. You see how much there is out there in the ocean. People breathe on their hand, and they could see that condensation collects there. So it might not have been completely, off base for people way back then to have thought that everything was made out of water. But anyway, we're no longer with Thales. The modern day monism says everything's not made out of water, but it's made out of matter, made out of physical material, made out of atoms. So Stoljar points out that some people refer to physicalism under the label materialism. That's just another similar label or synonym for it in philosophy, but I prefer the term physicalism over materialism, and I think the author does too, and there's certain reasons for that. Materialism has a separate meaning that's unrelated to its scientific or philosophical meaning. Maybe you've heard the word materialism in reference to people who only care about how they look or their possessions or material items, but that's not what it means in the scientific and philosophical sense. It means everything's made out of matter. So physicalism as a term avoids those false associations and connotations with other unrelated meanings of materialism. So anyway, physicalism, everything is physical. He says for us to really drill into this and understand it in more depth now, we have to try and grapple with two big questions about physicalism. Okay, so he lists these two big questions about physicalism, and he's going to try to answer these in the course of his paper. So what are they? Let's put them on the board. So these are, we'll say, two big questions about physicalism. Okay, so one of them he calls the interpretation question, and the other he calls the truth question. So let me list them and talk about them. Interpretation question and the truth question. Okay, so the interpretation question is this. The question asks, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? Physicalism says that everything's physical, but what does that mean? How do we interpret the meaning of that statement? So here we go. What does it mean? To say that everything is physical. Okay, that's a question. What does it mean to say that everything is physical? And then the truth question is related but separate, and this question asks simply, is it true, though, that everything is physical? Apart from what it means to say that, is it true? Is it true that everything is physical? Okay, so One question, what does it mean to say that everything's physical? A different question, is that true? Now, Stoljar says that in order to tackle one of these questions, you kind of have to tackle the other one first. And I'll throw that out to you in the chat. Let me know, if you can, which one of these two, according to your common sense, would you have to deal with first before you could really pursue the other one? Which one should be dealt with first in the order of these two questions? There's a logical reason behind it. So if you think about it, yes, that's right. The interpretation question has to come first. Kylie, no, it's not the truth question, but let me explain why, okay? You cannot determine whether a statement is true if you don't know what it means. You have to first know what the statement means before you can investigate its truth or falsehood. If I say to you right now, watch out, on Chapman campus, there's jargles all over the place. You don't know what I'm saying. You can't tell me whether that's true or not because it's a word that you don't know the definition of. So you can only go on to campus to determine whether this is correct or incorrect once you know what the statement means itself. So in the same sense, I won't be able to answer whether everything is physical is true or not unless I know what the claim means. So let's go into the interpretation question first. And then once we have some kind of suitable or satisfying answer to it, then we can move to the other one. Not to worry, Kylie. It's a totally reasonable assessment to have thought it the other way, but I just wanted to be clear. So we'll start with the interpretation question. Okay, so clearing the board, let's try and get into it. And he has a specific way that he thinks we need to grapple with this so-called interpretation question. Okay, so answering the interpretation question, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? To try and answer this, we need to look to what is called supervenience. The best way to answer this question is by means of the concept of supervenience. Now, this is a word that's kind of a piece of shop talk within philosophy and science. I've noticed that a lot of times your standard dictionary doesn't even include it, and so I keep getting spelling check errors, which you will get too when you write the paper if you write on this. But anyway, this is the way it's written and spelled, supervenience. Okay, supervenience. This is the concept that will give us our answer as to what it means to say everything's physical. So how can I explain supervenience? The best way, can it be read? Here, I'll just make sure it's clear. I'm going to type it in the chat because I can see there's a glare on the screen. Okay. So supervenience, how to understand it. The best way to understand it and to conceptualize it is through the example of what's called a dot matrix picture. Okay, so let me try to go over the concept of a dot matrix picture with you. Maybe you already have some working understanding of it or some background knowledge, but okay, if you look at images that are in printed materials, like on paper, like a newspaper photograph on the headline of the front page, or in comic books or something. If you're looking at comic strips or comic books, or you're looking at those pictures printed on the page, let me ask you something. If it's a dot matrix image that is printed on this page, then even if you're looking at the picture and it seems to be like President Biden signing a bill on the front page of the newspaper, if you zoom in really close under magnification, do you know what it is that you will see under magnification when you zoom in on that picture? Not looking at the big picture, but zooming in on sort of like a magnifying glass or such device. It's a picture, but it's made out of a bunch of tiny little, anybody have a guess?
Pixels?
Well, pixels would be the case, not with a printed image on a page, but on a digital screen, which I was going to talk about next. But in the old school world of physical materials that we don't as much read anymore or look at, they would be little ink dots. That's right, Kylie, correct. Yes, so this is true. How is it that we're able to replicate and duplicate the same image on every single copy of the newspaper? Well, here's the system. You have a grid against which a bunch of dots can be placed of various colors. And by assigning to each point on the grid a specific coloration of ink dot, we thus generate the large-scale image. And then once we have that mapping of assigned points to the grid, we can stamp it down on each new piece of paper to replicate it perfectly. Can this make sense to you? So, it's not magic how these pictures are formed. We first create a dot matrix that then can be grafted on to each new copy. Okay, so anyways, what a dot matrix picture is then, to kind of simplify, is it's just a big picture, but made out of a bunch of little dots of ink. Okay, and the array of dots being put in that position and order gives rise to the large-scale picture. In art, there's a technique called, there's mosaic, and there's also pointillism. And you can imagine with a mosaic, you've got a big picture that's made out of a bunch of tiny little tiles. So that's the kind of concept that I need you to conceptualize in your mind. A big picture, but it's formed out of an array of little dots. In one case, these could be dots of ink. Now, I start with the dot matrix example because philosophers describing the concept of supervenience in 20th century literature, a lot of them were writing in like the 70s and 80s, when dot matrix printers and images would have been more of a commonplace. Today, it seems like we're losing touch in a way with the old school world of paper. So we oftentimes are looking at images now on mobile devices, computer screens, or television screens. Now, to get to your comment there, Sydney, if you do have, let's say, an image like a meme that you're looking at on your computer or phone, you also could zoom in to that, and you would see that it is also constructed out of a bunch of little bits. But when it's a digitized image on a device like that, on a monitor or screen, what are these bits? They're no longer dots of ink, but we call those what? Do you know the word? The technical or the technological or computer word for this? The little things that form the grid against the back of your screen. They are what? Pixels. They are pixels, correct. Yeah, now I'm talking about pixels. So pixels, what are they? I mean, they're tiny little tricolor panels that form the resolution of your screen. And how is it that an image, like even my image, is being displayed right now to you on your screen? Because instructions are sent to the device to map out the pixels in a particular coloration and pattern. And so each pixel being illuminated in that particular way causes the image to exist. And so it's not magic how these devices work, right? How is it that the same image will appear on everybody's device when we, let's say, share a meme or a photo or a video? The same instructions are delivered to that device in terms of which pixels to illuminate. And so the digital instructions appear, and then we see the image. So whether you're thinking of a big image created out of a bunch of little ink dots, or you're thinking of a digital image created out of a bunch of little pixels, the concept of supervenience holds with both. The relationship between the large picture and the little underlying array of bits that make it up, this is how supervenience is explained. Now, I'm going to try and give you a visual to accompany my discussion here on the board. So what I will try to do on the board is to draw a crude attempt at a dot matrix image. Obviously, I'm not the best artist or anything, so forgive me, but I'll do what I can. So here we go. So this is the screen or the paper or whatever, and I'm drawing the dot matrix image. So I'm trying to draw it as though it's made out of a bunch of little dots. But I have a pretty blunt instrument with this marker, so I'll just do what I can. Okay. Okay, now I don't know if it's easy to see the representation of the image, but let's see. Hopefully this isn't too bad. What is depicted in this quote-unquote dot matrix picture I've drawn? What is that? What's the scene? The ocean? Yeah, it's like a day at the beach kind of thing, right? These are waves. That's the sun shining down from the side, and then what are those birds, bats, something flying over the water, okay? So that's like a scene, imagine, that I've drawn here on the board. And let's introduce a little terminology that the author brings in right now. The word is global features. What are global features? Okay, so a global feature of a dot matrix or a composite like that is just any large-scale aspect of the picture or composite. So a large-scale feature or aspect of the composite is something that is formed by the little pixels or dots in combination with each other. So it's not a dot, it's a thing that is created by many dots coming together in an array. So that's the term global feature. It is a large-scale aspect, a big picture aspect of the composite. Global features. What is it? It is a quote-unquote big picture aspect. Okay, so just to sort of check on your comprehension, with this concept now introduced, global features, it's a big picture aspect of the composite. It's a thing that's built out of the little dots, not one of the dots itself, but something that's created by many of them. What would you tell me is a global feature of this dot matrix image, for example? Okay, good. The waves would be one. That's one. Or you could have referred to the sun or the birds or whatever that are flying in the air. So those are the global features of this image. It's anything that you can point out that's an object or an event within the image that is the result of the aggregated little dots or pixels. So now, let's consider this guys together. Suppose that we have two dot matrices here. Suppose that I created a second one to the right. And imagine that the second dot matrix was dot for dot a replica of this one. So it has the exact same assignment of dots to each position on that other grid. If it's a perfect dot for dot duplicate, then what would the second dot matrix look like by comparison to the first? My question isn't if then. If I had a second matrix which had the same exact arrangement of dots, then by comparison with this, how would it appear? It would appear the same, exactly. Yeah, it would be a duplicate. It would be exactly the same. So can we agree that if there was this dot for dot duplicate, that it would have all the same global features? Wouldn't it? Yes. Would it still have the waves? Yes. Would it have the sun, the birds? Yes. Why? Because what are those things? They are just the array of dots that combine to make them. So of course, if you have a second closed system with the same exact arranged points, then they would have to have all the same global features as well. Okay, and now can we complete this thought together? Suppose that we had a second dot matrix which had different global features. Okay, so it's similar to this one, but there's no birds or whatever. If they have different global features, then that must mean that they also differ in what other fundamental way? So if they're different in the large scale aspects, then they must be different in what other sense? Yeah, in the placement and arrangement of the dots, correct. So here's the idea to really get clear in your mind. It has to do with comparing two. If we had two matrices with the same parts, the same dots in arrangement, then they would have to have the same large-scale features. And if we had two dot matrices with different large-scale features, then they would differ also in the placement of parts. So where the parts are the same, the whole will be the same. And where the whole is different, there will be differences in the arrangement of the parts. Okay? So now, with this example of supervenience, let me explain how supervenience would then be used as a verb. We say that the global features of the dot matrix supervene on the positioning of the dots. So anything that is depicted or shown in the big image is nothing other than a given arrangement of dots at the dot level. So with that in mind, we are now going to extend the example into an analogy about the physical universe, okay? Because that's what this is all about in the end. The claim that we're trying to defend is that, or the claim that we're trying to understand is that everything in the universe is made out of physical matter. So how does this apply to that? Okay. I want you to now consider our universe to be kind of like a big dot matrix. And it's got all kinds of objects and events in it that are made out of little things. But these little things of the universe that build it up are not dots of ink nor pixels, but there's something. What would you say is supposed to be the physical corollary to these pixels or dots in actual reality? Atoms, right. The tiny little things of matter that combine to form everything that exists, according to physicalism. So what physicalism believes is that in the same sense of this dot matrix example, everything in our whole big universe are made out of atoms. And so the global features of the universe are nothing other than the playing out of atoms that are arranged to form those objects. Can anybody tell me what they would give as an example of a global feature of reality, rather than this random example that I drew on the board? What are some global features of this universe? There you go, the moon, that would be one, sure. Because the moon is a thing that's made out of a bunch of particles. It's not a particle, but it is a thing that's formed by a bunch of particles. And so that could be like one object in the universe that we could construe as a global feature of it. How about this? Are you and I global features of this universe as well? Yes, according to the position of physicalism, just as much as anything else that exists. These tables, chairs around you, or if you're at home, the furniture in your house, those things are all just objects that are formed by the atoms that aggregate to create them. So everything in the universe is just an object that's made out of little atoms, just as in these dot matrix images. Everything that appears in the image is just the creation or product of a bunch of little dots or pixels. So now, remember what I was saying before about compare two different matrices, and if they had the same parts, they would have the same global features? Now we're going to try and take that little mental leap as applied to the universe. Okay, now this is a little bit of a stepping outside the box, but try and do with me, okay? I want you to imagine for a moment that, just for the sake of discussion, what if there was a second universe? Not just this whole universe, but a second one. If there was a second universe and physicalism is true, what if this other universe had the same exact atomic arrangement of atoms? Okay, so every atom in universe 2 is placed and arranged in the exact same order as it is here. So it's an atom for atom replica or duplicate of our universe. According to the idea of supervenience, if there was this atomic replica of our universe, what would it be like in comparison to ours? It would be the same, okay? So it would have the same global features, meaning the same objects and events would all exist in this duplicate universe. Would there be let me ask some questions about that, okay? So according to the example given, if we had this atomic copy of our universe, would Joe Biden be the president right now in that other universe? Yes, because it would be a carbon copy, so everything would be the same. All the events of history, current day, and into the past would have all been the same. Would JFK still have been assassinated? Yes, because what is that event? According to physicalism, that event is just a playing out of atoms given in a certain order and pattern. And so by hypothesis, if we had the same exact closed physical system with the same atoms and the same kind of structural arrangement, then yes, we would have exactly copied and duplicated events. Would there be a duplicate of you attending a university called Chapman, watching a lecture like this, having the same thoughts? Yes. And so that's really the key. Physicalism claims that everything's made out of matter, meaning that everything supervenes on atoms. And what that means, among other things, is that there's no possible way there could be a second physical copy of the universe but different mental phenomena. So your thoughts and your hopes, fears, dreams, anxieties, desires, pleasures, pains, all that stuff going on in your mental life is really just the result of your brain and its physical configuration. And so if there was another doppelganger universe to this one with the same atomic facts arranged just like these, then there would be the same psychological facts happening in that universe too. So your consciousness would be governed by the same kind of features. That's what dualists usually don't agree with. They say that the mind is separate from the brain and body, so that no matter what's going on with the brain and the body, the mind would be independent and liberated from that. According to dualism, it should be possible to imagine a duplicate physical system where you're having different thoughts, because your thoughts, according to dualism, are not necessarily rooted in the physical composition of the brain and its atomic structure. But on physicalism, that is what consciousness is. So again, according to a physicalist, if you have a physical system which is identical in terms of its atomic particles to the first one, then it would have to have the same sociological, biological, and psychological facts. This gives rise to his precise statement of physicalism, which you find on page 580. So I'm going to write that on the board, and that kind of caps off this part of the notes. So physicalism is true at a possible world W. Just in case the following. Just in case any world which is an atomic duplicate of W is a duplicate in all respects. Okay, so if physicalism is true in our universe, that means that if there were another universe, hypothetically, of course we're not saying there actually is. I mean, I know universe just means one. But anyway, if physicalism is true in our universe, then if there were another one that was atomically the same as ours, it would have to be the same in every way, not just physically similar, but psychologically identical, historically identical, behaviorally identical, and all of that. So yes, that's what it means to say that everything is physical. It means to say that everything supervenes on atoms, and the atomic placement and arrangement of atoms governs all, including your consciousness. So much so that if we could imagine another physical universe with the same atomic facts and the same distribution of atoms, then in that universe, all things would be replicated even down to the last detail of human consciousness and mental introspection. So I'll read from it, and here's how he says some of that. He says, the basic idea is that the physical features of the universe are like the dots in the dot matrix, and the psychological or biological or social features of the universe are like the global properties of the picture. Just as the global features of the picture are nothing other than a pattern of dots, so too the psychological, biological, and social features of the world are nothing but a pattern in the physical features of the world, which stands in for atoms and the placement of atoms. To use this language of supervenience, just as the global features of the picture supervene on the dots, so too everything supervenes on physical atoms if physicalism is true. So, according to this, what it means is that if physicalism is true, there's no possible world which could be identical to this world in every physical way, but not identical in some biological, social, or psychological way. So that's what it is to believe physicalism is true. To think that everything's made out of matter is to believe that everything supervenes on atoms, and your consciousness and all aspects of human thought and mental life are determined by the arranged atoms, as said. Yeah, so this is like the core commitment of physicalism, the position of supervenience. To be a physicalist, you would have to agree that supervenience is true. Cordy, thanks. The quote would be found on page 580. So you'll see it on the 580 page. Thank you for that. Dualists are those that would reject supervenience. It would be a dualist who would say, no, even if there was another universe, which was down to the last atom the same, my mind could think of anything because my mind is not necessarily rooted in the material composition of the atoms that make up my body and brain. But this is what the physicalist holds true, and that's why there's a difference of opinion and argument here. Now, we've therefore tried to tackle the interpretation question, what it means to say that everything is physical. But that still leaves us with the other question to deal with, and that was the truth question, if you remember. The question was, is it true that everything is physical? So Stoljar does think it's true, and he has two different arguments that he's going to provide to try and support that it is true. Okay, so let me put it here. So the first argument for the truth of physicalism, he calls the argument from causal closure. Okay. Let's make sure that you're spelling it right, because it's not the word casual, which is a common misspelling of this word. Casual is like whatever, you're wearing sweats to work or something, but causal has to do with cause and effect. And so it's a different word with a different spelling, C-A-U-S-A-L, not C-A-S-U-A-L. So the argument from causal closure, this argument has three premises which lead to the ultimate conclusion, and I'll just write them and talk about them as we go through them. So the first premise of the argument says, every event that has a cause has a physical cause. Okay, so every event that has a cause has a physical one. That's the first premise. Okay, so it's saying that because we live in a physical universe, if something happens, then there had to at least have been one physical cause that caused it to happen, because things can't happen without some kind of physical basis. If, say, a tree branch falls on your car's hood and causes a dent, it didn't just happen for no reason physically. I mean, it happened because of the gradual weakening of the branch over time, and then maybe a sudden gust of wind, then its mass and the wind's trajectory and the forces of gravity caused it to descend and cause the impact. So that's just one example, but everything in the universe is like that. If something's happening in this universe, we can trace it back to some physical cause. Now, the second premise says this. It's kind of interesting, but what it says is mental events can cause physical events. Now, let me explain the second premise. All the second premise is really saying is that thought can cause your behavior. Like by thinking of something, you can make your body do it. Here's an easy example. So see my left hand, I just snap my fingers. Why did that happen? What was the cause of that event? Well, I mean, we could start by just talking about the muscles. We could say, okay, there's muscle groups in the hand which contracted because of nerve signals that were sent to the hand from the brain, causing it to produce this motion where you hear the snap. But then you can ask the further question, why were the nerve signals sent from the brain to the hand to cause that motion? Well, because I thought of it, because I thought, here, let me show my students how this works, how when you think of something, then it can happen by doing it. And it's the same thing that you're doing if you're typing in notes or if you're, if you raise your hand in class. Why does the hand go up? That's a physical action, but it happens because the student has the will and the desire to ask the question. Even right now, why are these words coming out of this person that's talking to you? That's an event that's happening, and it's happening because I'm thinking. I want to deliver the lecture and I want to deliver the information to my students. So, I mean, I hope that's just perfectly clear. It's just being alive as a living thing. You think and then things happen. You get on a bike, you say, I'm going to ride this bike, then the bike ride happens. And so from top to bottom, every action that's under your voluntary control starts with a thought and then the action follows from there. I'll give one more example. We talked about the assassination of JFK. Okay, why did he die? That's an event. He died because of the impact of a bullet. Why did that bullet hit him? Well, because it was ejected from the firing mechanism of a firearm. And why did that happen? Well, the cause of that was pressure applied to the trigger mechanism. And why did that happen? Because of the contracting of muscles in the hand of the person. And why did that happen? Because of nerve signals sent from the brain. But why did the nerve signals get sent? Because this person had an intention to kill John F. Kennedy. And so it was his thoughts that led to the actual results in the end. So anyway, I'm just giving you different examples so that you can clearly understand the point of the second premise. It's just saying, in general, what holds all these examples in common, that it's thought leading to an action. So mental events, thinking, choosing, deciding, can cause physical events that are shown and elicited by your behavior. And then now there's the third premise. Now the third premise looks a little tricky at first, complex, but I'll try to bring it down to earth so that it's not so bad in the end. But bear with me as I write it. So it says this. It says, if an event A causes an event B, then that's the only cause of B, basically. So I'll write it like this. If an event A causes an event B, then in that case, there is no other event, call it C, which is different from A and which also causes B. So I'll break that down in a minute. Okay, so I'll write it in the chat because I can see a little bit of a glare. Not to worry though. The third premise. So there's that third premise in the chat typed in. If an event A causes an event B, then there's no other event C that is different from A and which also causes B. Okay, so what this is saying is that if A is the cause of B, it's the only cause. That's all it's really saying. It's just saying that if A causes B, that's it. There's nothing else different from A, which also causes B too. It's just A. So maybe to make it a little more straightforward, let's see if you can finish my thought here. What premise 3 is saying is that for every event, there's how many causes exactly, not more and not less. For each event, for each effect, it says there's how many causes? One and not more than one. That's what it says. So if A is the cause of B, that's it. It's the only cause. There's nothing else that's different from A that also causes B too. Okay, so putting these three premises together, what follows from them? According to the author Stoljar, the conclusion from these three premises is that mental events are physical events, and that is just saying that physicalism is true. Because if mental events are physical events, then everything's physical, because that's the only thing that anybody thinks is not physical, the mind. So, therefore, conclusion, mental events are physical events. And I'll explain how that follows just now. Okay, so mental events are physical events. So like when you're thinking, that's just physical too. Do the thoughts and stuff that cause your behavior, that's just physical too, so everything's physical. So let's go through the argument and see how that comes to the conclusion. From the first premise, every event that ever happens has to have at least one physical cause. From the second premise, the mind can cause your physical behavior. But look at those two premises put together. The second one says that your mind can cause your behavior, but the first one says that every event that has a cause has a physical cause, which means that when your mind does produce your behavior, it's the brain that's producing it. And so it's just a physical brain doing a physical thing. The third premise then is all important because what it says is this. Since we know that your brain is the physical cause of your behavior, it's basically claiming that that's the only cause of your observable behavior, that it's not both the brain, but also separate from that completely, something supernatural like a soul or this non-physical mind that dualists talk about. So the third premise is basically trying to exclude from consideration other causes of your behavior aside from the physical cause of the brain. I guess the way that the argument is looking at things is that that would be more causes than is necessary. If the brain is sufficient to explain the behavior that you perform, why add to the picture and say, well, there's also the soul too, though? I mean, the brain is there, and we know that that's a physical cause of your behavior. So why suggest that it is the brain and also something completely independent from the brain that can exist without it? That would be to have one cause too many. That would be more causes than is necessary to explain these observable effects, namely your behavior and so on. So again, everything that has a cause has a physical one. Your mind can cause things, so that must be physical. And there's nothing else aside from the physical explanation that's either needed or even available to explain those events. So everything's physical, including your thoughts that produce your actions. If so, then physicalism's true. Now, there's one other argument that he does give, I said. A second argument, a second way of trying to make the case that physicalism's true. In my opinion, though, this is the more interesting argument out of the two. So if I was the one like choosing between them, I'd prefer this one because I think it's more interesting. But the other one he also talks about, and it's a little easier to understand, even though it's less interesting in my view. But here's what it is. It's called the argument from methodological naturalism. Okay, so the argument from methodological naturalism. The first premise of the argument just says this, that it is reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. Here. Okay, so first premise says, as you can see, it's reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. Now that is, I think, a pretty straightforward principle. It's just saying that whatever scientific community believes as a consensus view, it would be reasonable for you to believe that as well. I mean, it's hard to disagree with that because even if some people don't like or find favor with scientific claims, I really don't think anybody's in position to say, well, these are just wacky people coming up with stuff out of nowhere. I mean, at a minimum, you have to concede that scientists are reasonable because everything they say has to be provided on the basis of empirical evidence that's experimentally verified. So you couldn't be a scientist who just says, I've got a wild guess and I have no proof of it. That's not science. Science is, of course, crucially based on giving experimental confirmation for your theories. So you don't just give a hypothesis, but you have to be able to verify it through test and experiment. So at a minimum, it's not really easy to say that scientists are unreasonable. Maybe some people will agree or not agree with their claims, but being reasonable is probably not their issue, if anything. So that's the first principle premise. It's reasonable to believe what's believed by the methods of science. So if you agree with or you follow the scientific community's consensus, you'll kind of like inherit their reasonability. You're piggybacking on their claims, and their claims are reasonable. The second premise is straightforward from there. It just says, physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. And so these two pieces just come together to imply that it's reasonable to believe physicalism. So therefore, it is reasonable to believe physicalism. Okay, so the basic gist of this argument is it's saying whatever scientists believe in the scientific community is a reasonable thing for you to believe too. And they believe in physicalism methodologically as scientists. So therefore, it would be reasonable for you to believe it also. It's like saying if you go with the scientists, you'll be reasonable like they are, and they all believe physicalism. So if you believe that, you're reasonable too. It's an argument. In a way, I can understand how the premises are persuasive. I mean, physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. That's a given, and it is generally a reasonable thing to follow scientific consensus. The only thing about the argument, though, to me that makes it less intellectually satisfying is it doesn't tell you why they believe this. It just says, follow their lead, and then they become like this black box. They just say things, and we defer to their expertise without really knowing why or how. Even though that might not be intellectually satisfying, there's a reasonable basis for that because we don't all have the time in our lives to focus on becoming these specialists in all these scientific fields. So we do have to defer to like people that are specialized in chemistry, physics, quantum theories, unless we want to focus on those and make that our pursuit in life to get very technical skilled in that. So a lot of our lives as citizens and as people does depend on deference to the collected expertise of the scientific community. But nonetheless, I can feel you and sympathize if you feel that that's like a little less intellectually satisfying than being told the reasons. At least with the causal closure argument, you are told directly, here are the reasons, because there can't be more causes than one, and the brain is known as a cause of your behavior. So how about that? That's the only cause. At least that's something for you to consider. In this case, it's like, hey, scientists are over there doing smart stuff. Who knows why? But just believe what they believe and you'll be reasonable too. So I find that they're both interesting arguments, but I find the other a little more satisfying in my mind. So I'm going to have to close our stream because we've reached 10:50. Let me know that you guys are good to go. I don't want to say goodbye until you do. But yeah, we'll continue working through these notes on Monday. On Monday, we will talk about the article from J.J.C. Smart called Sensations and Brain Processes. And then we'll talk about Alan Turing on Wednesday. So those are the next two things coming up. Cordy, as neurological research develops, we better understand the physical mechanisms that underlie our mental life. And that's true, yes. So the dominant view is monism. Yeah, in science for sure. But everyday people and some philosophers, do advance pretty clever and I think compelling arguments for dualism too. And so in my view, there's room to have this debate. And there's still plenty of open questions. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. And I want to say to the remaining members of the class that are not attending as regularly, you have to come to class. You need to come to class. You should want to come to class. So I don't know why you don't want to or why you're not doing it, but more of you have to come to this core group of like a dozen. Perfect. I appreciate it. But we shouldn't see like half of the class not attending. So just know that you need to come to class. Anyways, have a great weekend, guys. Thank you so much. If you need anything, you can email me or come to office hours, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.